In the previous video, we looked at writing Bolt plans to run Puppet code on your infrastructure, and we did that by running Bolt on the command line. Today we're going to look at using GitHub Actions to create a CI pipeline to manage your Puppet deployments. And by using GitHub Actions to drive our Puppet workflow, the process of releasing a new Puppet change becomes just pressing merge. If you didn't see my previous video walking through step by step how to create a Bolt project and write a Bolt plan to run Puppet, then check out the video in the channel. But for now, let's dive in and look at GitHub Actions. So here we've got a Bolt project that is very similar to the one that we spun up in the last video. And I'm able to run a Bolt plan called Bolt Demo Puppet, which will execute the Puppet code that I've got in this repository against my remote node, demoubuntu.craigdunn.net here. So what we want to do is tie this process in with GitHub Actions. So when we merge anything to this repository, it'll automatically kick off a Bolt plan run job. So first let's create a basic GitHub Actions workflow. That's really simple. We just create in the root directory of our repository a new folder called .github. Directly under that folder within .github we create a subfolder called workflows, and this is where all of our GitHub workflows will live. And to create a workflow we simply just create a YAML document in this directory. So let's go new file in here, and we're going to call this one bolt.yaml. So we're going to create a fairly simple GitHub Actions workflow here. The first thing we're going to tell GitHub is when we want to trigger this job. So we're going to say on, and we're going to say on push branches master. So this tells GitHub Actions that we want to run this job whenever there is a commit or a push to the master branch of the repo. So now I'm going to create the job itself that's going to run our Bolt plan. So we start this off with jobs. I'm going to call the job Bolt. We need to tell GitHub Actions which of the images we want to run this job on. So I'm going to run on, and we'll run this on Ubuntu latest. And now I'm going to run this job within a container. And the container I'm going to use is provided by Puppet, which is puppet/puppet-bolt. This is the officially shipped Docker container image for running Bolt. Now the next thing, we need to specify the steps of our job. So steps. Now the first one we're going to do here is install Git. The Puppet Bolt's container image doesn't have Git installed. It probably should, given the fact that Git is widely used with it. But for now we have to do this manually. So we're going to have a step called install Git. And the command that we're going to run will be apt update, and then apt-y for non-interactive install Git. Next step in our job is going to be to check out the repository that we're working against. So that's pretty standard. We're just going to give it name of checkout, and we're going to use the checkout actions, checkout action, and I'll use version 3 of that. And now it's time to actually write the steps for invoking Bolt itself. And if you remember from the last video, there's a step we need to do before we run Bolt, which is to pull in all of the Puppet modules that we've got defined here in our Bolt project.yaml. And we did that before with the Bolt module install command, and that populated all of the modules, or third-party modules that we're going to use here, like accounts, standard lib, sudo. So these aren't going to be available to the job itself. If we look in git ignore here, we're not committing the .modules directory into the repo. So the job will need to download these modules before we go any further. So let's go back into our bolt.yaml. And the next step is going to be bolt install modules. That's just going to be bolt module install. Once we've got all the modules available, we can now actually run our Bolt plan. So we're just going to say here bolt apply, and the command that we want to run is bolt plan run. I'm going to do -v so we get some verbose output, followed by the name of the plan. So if we look under here in plans, we've got puppet.pp. So the plan name is bolt demo : puppet. And using the -t argument for targets, I'm going to just tell it to run it against all hosts in the inventory.yaml. Right now we just have the one. So we're nearly ready to run this plan on GitHub Actions, but there's one consideration that we haven't thought of yet. If we look over here in the inventory.yaml, In order to SSH into our target nodes and apply the plan, it's going to need a private key. So right now I'm telling Bolt to get the private key from my home directory under .ssh. So we've got a couple of choices here. I could have GitHub Actions actually deploy this out as a file and leave this as it is. I prefer to do this with environment variables and GitHub secrets. So I'm going to change this up a little bit. So instead of having private key as a file, we can actually change this to be private key and then a subkey here of key data. And this tells Bolt that we're going to give it the raw key data rather than the location of the file. And obviously we don't want to paste the SSH private key in here, so we're going to have this source from an environment variable. So to do that, we can use the mvar plugin. So we come down here, another indent, and we can specify that the key data is going to be populated by this plugin, which is mvar. And then the actual variable that we're going to use, let's call it bolt SSH key. So now Bolt is going to be expecting an environment variable called bolt SSH key to be populated with the private key that we need to use to connect to this host. So that's all good. Save that. So now I need to put my private key into GitHub Actions as a secret. So firstly, I'm just going to copy the contents of my private key, which is in ID Bolt. Now we're going to head over to the GitHub repo that we're going to be committing this into, and if we come under here under settings on the top right, and then down here on the left, we want secrets and variables, expand that, and we want to add a secret for GitHub Actions, so expand that, and I want new repository secret. So the name of my secret here, let's keep it the same, so bolt SSH key, and then I can paste the contents of that key into here. And now I can see down here I've got a new repository secret called bolt SSH key. And if you just spent half an hour paused on the previous screen trying to copy down my SSH private key, just know that with a video editor this really isn't that hard. So now we've got a secret in GitHub Actions called bolt SSH key, and Bolt itself is going to be expecting an environment variable called bolt SSH key. We just need to tie these two things together in our bolt.yaml GitHub Actions workflow file. And at the top here, I'm just going to set an environment variable. And the environment variable I want to create is bolt SSH key. And then the value is going to come from GitHub Actions secrets. So I start with secrets.bolt SSH key. So this here is being pulled from GitHub Actions secrets, and then it'll assign this value to an environment variable called bolt SSH key. And that environment variable will be able to be read by the steps further down the line, notably when we try and run the Bolt plan. So let's just add my new GitHub Actions workflows, and I'm going to commit all these changes in. And now I'm going to push my master branch up to the origin. And now back on my repository, if I click here into Actions, I can see that I've got a job currently in process. And if I click that, and then I can see it's the Bolt job that's running. We can see it's already got past installing all the modules. Oh, we can see here it's just finished. So we can see here from the output here that the first step was to initialize the containers. So we're using the Puppet Bolt Docker container. We installed Git. And then after checking out the repository, here we do the Bolt module install. So this is where we've read in our Bolt project.yaml and deployed all of the third-party Forge modules. And then here we've got our Bolt apply, where we've actually connected to my remote host and applied our plan, which is a Puppet run. Now we've got a GitHub Actions driven workflow in place to manage changes. Let's make a change. So I'm going to follow a bit of a pull request workflow here. So first I'm just going to create a Git branch here, a Git feature branch. And the change I'm going to make here is fairly simple. We're going to go into the hiro data into common.yaml, and I'm just going to create a new user. So I'm just going to copy this here and paste that, and let's call this user, oh, we've got our indenting slightly out. Call this user Susan, Susan somebody. Susan is also an admin, and let's just leave the SSH key the same. Save that. So now my workflow now, if I commit here a change into my Puppet code and push that feature branch. Let's flip back over to our repository. We can see the GitHub showing us that we've got a recently pushed branch, and do we want to make a pull request? Yes, we do. and I can create that pull request here. So in a more complete real world scenario, I would probably have another GitHub Actions job in here to run the Puppet job in a sort of no-op mode to test the changes before we merge them in. For now, I can see that this PR wants to add this user called Susan. And if I'm happy with that, I can merge that. Now, as soon as I merge that, that's created a push into the master branch. And if I go and click on Actions, we can see that we've kicked off a new job here, which is coming from my pull request. And I can click into this to monitor what it's doing. So now GitHub Actions has kicked off my Bolt plan run. It's now applying the catalog. And there we go, I have a successful job. And if I look under the Bolt apply output, we can see that the user Susan was created on the remote host. So there you have it, short and sweet. We've got a GitHub Actions driven CI pipeline for our Puppet changes. I'm really keen to answer any questions and make some videos that address pain points that you might be having around Bolt or GitHub Actions or Puppet. So if you've got anything in specific that you've got on your mind, then leave a comment below and I'll see if I can answer that. If you did like this video, as I always say, there's a button for that. I'm Craig Dunn and see you in the next one.